Hello, folks, and I told you guys I'd be back sometime this week. Hello, everybody. I come out here for a gear change show, kind of early this week. Usually do these on Saturdays, but I decided to do this on a Wednesday instead of a Saturday because I just want to switch things up a little bit. Hello, everybody. I hope you guys didn't miss me. I just wanted to let everybody know I'm officially back. So I did a live stream for Mafia 2 Mayhem Shoot Around, Run Around on Monday. It's loaded in the live section if you guys want to know. And I'm also uploading some Gran Turismo stuff that I want to put. So I'm producing 2 videos. So in the last couple of days I produced in the last 2 days, I produced like 3 videos, which is more than I have. So I wanted to talk about something that's been kind of interesting and where a lot of people, some people are misguided in their judgments of a certain motorsports engine or Indianapolis engine. So I've been cruising the internet a heck of a lot, and I noticed that when people talk about the Penske Mercedes 500i Wonder engine, the word that a lot of you guys, especially a lot of automotive people, they like to use the word loophole a lot to describe this engine. They like to call this engine a cheater. It abused the rules. It wasn't a very fair engine. It was kind of a bomb that kind of set off a lot of bad things. And a lot of people kind of attribute this to kind of tribute the stock-block Mercedes, the 3.4 overhead valve motor that produced north of 1,000 horsepower. But and a lot of people will sit there like, oh, this exploited a loophole in the rules, and this was they used the engine, and this engine was going to dominate every year, and it was unfair because the teams couldn't respond, and it was and so to speak. So now, usually most people who defend this motor or defend Penske or defend the engineering from Ilmore usually say it didn't abuse a loophole. It feels like it abused a loophole, but I'll tell you why it didn't. I'll tell you what would have made it a loophole and why it seemed that it was a loophole to use. So I'm probably going to do this in 3 parts. I'm going to do this one. I'm probably going to do one today, tomorrow, and then maybe Friday night probably. So this is going to be a 3-parter. So I'm going to talk about Indianapolis engines in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So for those of you, I already probably covered this, but Indianapolis used to have special rules. Now, Indianapolis has always had special engine rules, and I believe the cubic inch limit at Indy at one point was like 600 cubic inches, which is almost like 9 liters or something like that. There were different engines that came through, and because that's how you could generate power, because that's how you generated power, more displacement, more power, because turbocharging wasn't really a big thing back then, especially in the early days of the Indy 500 and in Grand Prix racing especially. If you wanted more power, you had to increase your displacement. It wouldn't be until like the 20s, it wouldn't be like till the 20s and the 30s when Maserati, Alfa Romeo, and would use it in Europe, but we didn't really use it over in America because we didn't have that sort of thing. When those cars came over here to compete in different events, it was sort of foreign, foreign technology for us because, there's always been the American way of getting horsepower has always been displacement. So, replacement of displacement. So the bigger you are, the bigger your engine, the more compression you could hit. The bigger your cylinders could be, the more you could do that. It wasn't uncommon for Indy racers or Grand Prix or circle track or sweepstake races or whatever, like Indy and a couple other places on dirt ovals and also wood planked ovals. Yes, you heard me correctly. Wood planked ovals. Yeah, they used to have wood planked ovals. This was before they were able to get dirt and make them banked eventually. And somebody got the bright idea to bank the tracks. Because they would hold the cars a little bit better because they would keep them stable at speed because of the mechanical grip and that sort of thing. And the straighter you kept the car, and the straighter you kept the car, and the straighter you kept the car, because it's just a curve. It's just a straight curve around a turn on an oval. So it's how the cars are able to generate so much speed coming off the turns and stuff like that. How they're able to hold their speed when you're on an oval. That's how Indy cars are able to do 220, 230 on an oval without blinking an eye today. So, I think the most maximum allowed back in 1911, between 1911 pre-war, in the First World War, I think it was around 600 cubic inches, and I think it dropped because of saving gas and rationing and stuff like that. And I think that was mostly, and usually if you wanted to get more power, you usually put more displacement because, as I said, we didn't have turbocharging or supercharging around here, and that was more of a European thing. And it was a lot more expensive to have the European technology, so we wanted to do it the old way. We just made it bigger and bigger engines. It wasn't uncommon for Grand Prix or track racing cars to have four to six cylinders. And some of the cylinders on some of these four cylinders, like the Buick Bug, they had it was this racer that raced at Indy and a bunch of other places. The cylinders the displacement was so big. You have to remember, it was like 500-600 cubic inches. In a four-cylinder engine, the cylinders were big as probably as wide as probably as wide, or probably wider, not wider than my head. Probably as wide as my head, probably a little bit wider in circumference, and that's because that was what they needed to put the compressions on so they could get more power. And these cars really didn't have a heck of a lot of power. These cars maybe had maybe 80, 90, maybe 100 horsepower at best. They weren't really big cars, and and the tires were kind of skinny, so really couldn't go super fast. So you can imagine these cars were probably going 30, 40, maybe 50, 60 miles an hour. That was it. They weren't going that fast, and the average speeds weren't any higher. And that's because they had ride-on mechanics and stuff like that, so the cars were a lot heavier. And the cars had to be big and brutal, big, heavy, and be able to take a hit going into the walls, in Indianapolis, and riding over the dirt when it became a proper paved track and stuff like that. So that went until the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and then when the post-war hit, and then when pre-war hit, most I'm going to say by the early 30s, late 40s, we started seeing the Offenhauser, well, 30s, 40s, 50s, we started seeing the Offenhauser brand. And their, um, their setup was mostly displacement heavy cars. Now, the maximum back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, 40s and 50s was, I think, 4.4, 4.3, 4.4 liters, or I think the maximum for a engine, well, these were all four-cylinder engines. These were big. Remember, I think the biggest motor they ever made was 270 cubic inches, big motor, and to generate to generate maybe 100, maybe 150 to 200 horsepower, and cars weren't really going all that fast. It wasn't until the Roadsters came out in like the late 40s, early 50s, pioneered by Bill Volkovich and AJ Foyt, um, Johnny Rutherford and the Unzers early on. Wilbur Shaw was early on, but guys that really were pioneers and real tough guys and stuff like that. So, and there was tough guys that would be able to pilot these things, and some of these engines, and what was happening was in the smaller ranks, late 50s, early 60s, it was having an Offenhauser engine was a great engine. They were built very well. They were super reliable. They were built to run and run and run. They were built to just run. They weren't. You never heard of maybe a transmission gave up, maybe a drivetrain gave up, but an Offenhauser was just built to run like a clock. They were built well. They were reliable. They were well proven by the 60s, and they started becoming more expensive, especially with the turbocharging route going on, and with the Fords invading at the time with the Lotus program, and of course the Novi, which was fast, produced 500 horsepower but wasn't very reliable. One of Bobby Unser's first cars, and a lot of these engines were starting to become a lot more expensive, and teams needed, especially in the lower formulas, a lot of teams needed something to a lot of the smaller guys wanted to save money or not have to spend as much money but get more power off the Offenhauser engines. And what happened was USAC, the United States Auto Club, Auto Championship, or Auto Club, United States Auto Club, or the USAC as we call it here in the U.S. Well, used to. I don't know if USAC is still around, but not as prevalent as it used to be. And they said in their midget divisions, you could run a bigger motor than the Offenhausers that were run by the other competition. Now, guys like AJ Foyt and anybody who had a lot of money or owned teams or were just well known for their driving prowess got these engines, or they were sponsored, or they got a lot of money back, or they got a lot of backing to get these engines. Younger guys like Parnelli Jones and all these other guys who were racing the midgets and wanted to keep the budgets down so that they could have enough money to race at the Indy 500 and such, needed a cheaper way to run. So the USAC drew up the stock block rules, and you could basically run a bigger engine than the Offenhauser. So I think it was 60. So I think it was like 1960, either in Oswego or DuQuoin, or one of the fairgrounds, or one of the dirt tracks, and Parnelli showed up. Parnelli Jones, the late Parnelli Jones, who just died at 90, showed up with this Chevrolet that was 30 cubic inches bigger than the Offenhauser, that four-cylinder that AJ at the time, and I think it had 30 cubic inches, and I think another 50 horsepower, something like that, over him. And it took a couple of races for it to get there, but took a couple of races for him to get a hang of it and stuff like that. And then eventually USAC was like, we could probably use this for the Indy 500. And then eventually they implemented the stock block rules at Indianapolis. So if you didn't want to run a turbocharged Ford or an Offenhauser, either a V8 2.65 liter, 2.61 liter, not 2.65, 2.61 Ford, or an Offenhauser, either a Ford V8 or an Offenhauser, or some Gurney Westlake engine that was being run at the time, you could get an off-the-shelf engine that you could build yourself. The engine, I believe, could be bigger than 5 liters. I think you got to remember, the bigger the motor, the more horsepower you're going to make, and the more competitive you can be, and you're not going to spend a heck of a lot of money on the racing. And Gurney used this, kind of took the idea from the Lotus programs that won the Indianapolis 500 earlier in the decade, and he kind of saw that, having a bigger displacement motor that was normally aspirated could be more reliable than the turbo cars, especially now that the mid-engine concept had been proven right in the early 60s. Dan Gurney lined up in 67, 68, I think, at one point with one of his Gurney rock arm motor, over the Offenhauser double overhead cam 2.61 liter Offenhausers, and the Offenhausers were all made over, and the Offenhauser and the stock block Chevrolets were all making, or Gurney Westlakes were making around the same power, and they proved to be reliable enough, but they weren't fast enough as the other ones. Offenhauser would power a lot of wins between the late 50s to early 70s, and eventually mid 75. Foyt made his Ford engines. Well, Foyt's engines were Fords anyway, so it didn't really matter. So, and Gurney also had his Eagles with his own Westlake power. Those were the Jorgensen Eagles, 2.61 liter cars making 1,200 horsepower, as Bobby Unser claimed to John Miller. So, Robin Miller of Indianapolis Star fame, the columnist that's passed away not long ago. And that was kind of right around where the white paper kind of came out. Dan Gurney was like, there's not enough sponsorship, the teams can't survive. I think that's kind of where they kind of started to come out with the uniform. We're going to use one style engine, it's going to be the same for everybody. And that kind of stagnated the stock block rule set for a little bit. That kind of led to the Cosworth DFX coming out in 2.65 liters. The March chassis and the early Penske chassis would use these engines. Ground effect would come through, and the stock block rules were sort of ignored because the DFX, and then eventually the Ilmor Chevrolet came out in the 1980s. But it was around like the mid 80s to early 90s that two manufacturers were starting to look at the USAC rules, because the USAC rules were updated. No one really used the stock block engine unless they were really poor. I mean, some people did use a big engine too, but if you wanted to win in the Indy 500 and guarantee a spot in the field in 33, you either went with Cosworth, or in the late 80s, early 90s, you went with Ilmor Chevrolet. So But two manufacturers came out with an engine, and there was two manufacturers back in the 80s and 90s came out with an engine that was pretty revolutionary. So there was a team called Maynard's and Buick. You're probably sitting there going, Buick, huh? The luxury car brand. You gotta remember, back in the late 70s, early 80s, Buick was trying to dip its toes in the turbocharger because they were running the Grand National with a turbo, the Regal, and the turbo with the Grand National experimental with the turbos. And somebody got the bright idea of taking a one of those engines, cutting the displacement to 3.3 liters, and then Maynard's V6 was also, and what would happen is because the volume of the engine went up high, and I think they were single turbocharged, the volume of most cars, back between Cosworth and Ford and Illinois Chevrolet, the maximum boost you could run was 45. In the late 80s, early 90s, the maximum boost you could run was like 1.6, I think like 1.6 bar, which was 45 feet per square inch or 45 feet per square inch or something like that in the engine, and that would give the motors around 700 to 800 horsepower, usually between Ford and Chevrolet. What happened with the stock block off-the-shelf engines was they were allowed to run 10% more inches of boost to 55 inches per square inch, or pressure, and that gave them an additional 150 horsepower at the then the 150 at the time, extra 150 horsepower or more at the time. So let's say the regular Cosworth and the regular Elmore Chevrolet engines were producing around, let's say I'm just going to use a round number, 700 horsepower. The stock blocks would use around 850 because no one really gives out a. So these engines were in the rule book. It was written in a rule book that USAC wrote for the Indy 500 only, because only these engines could be run the Indy 500, because USAC ran the Indy 500. CART and a bunch of the other championships like F5000 stuff like that were run under their own championships, and CART was just its own championship that was formed in the 1978 to because before that it was just the USAC oval. It was basically the USAC road racing championship, or the USAC oval, or Indy, or as it was called, Champ Car back then. It actually called the USAC cars Champ Cars back then. And back in the early 1900s, like 1910 to 1930, those cars were called Champ Cars. So that's where the name stuck, and that's the reason why Champ Car, or Champion Auto Racing Teams, got formed in the 70s, and that's the reason why Champ Car got put in when CART died in the late 2000s, in the early 2000s, 2003. I remember reading in Auto Week that day when they announced that CART was going to be dissolved, and I didn't know at the time how big CART was, but it was a big deal. So the reason why and the teams that use the stock block were usually teams that were low on budget. They were low budget. It was guaranteed to get you into the 500 if you could make it last, and the engines were not very stable. If you look at the records, or if you look at the race day of all the stock blocks that competed, you'll notice that only of all the stock blocks that competed, only two of them actually won the Indy 500 and actually finished well and actually won it, and that was, of course, the Penske Mercedes in 1994. So it was really meant for the little guy who really didn't have a lot of money and didn't want to spend a heck of a lot of money running a 265. And these were for smaller teams. It was aimed for, teams who ran midgets and, the dirt cars, the midget slash Silver Crown, the modified cars and stuff like that. Guys who ran on the small track and modifieds, or on the midgets, or in the Super Crowns, or in the super modifieds and stuff like that. This was meant for them, and this wasn't really meant for the big teams like Penske or Ganassi or Newman Haas at the time. It was kind of meant to. It was meant for the little guy, so the little guy could get into the 500 and say, we got into the 500. They ran a couple of laps, and then they would last maybe quarter of the distance, and then the turbo would puff, and it would be that big. It was only meant to get you into the show. And as I said, only two stock blocks ever finished. I think the one of them was in like the 90, was in early 90, and I think the other one was 94. And Penske won at 94 with Al Unser. But now that you know the premise of the stock block rules, I'm going to tell you why. Now, I'm going to come at this at a different angle. I'm not going to play fanboy to Penske, because Penske has broken every rule in the book. I'm not a big fan of him ruining it, because, and you're going to see why this big Penske Mercedes engine ended up causing a lot more problems than you think. So, and why it kind of messed up open wheel racing, and why Penske is still kind of ruining the consequences to this day with his team, even though he's won the Indianapolis 500 legit 19 times. Although a lot of people don't think one of those wins should have been the books, but obviously it did, because obviously it did in some people's eyes. But I will show you guys tomorrow why this engine was a brilliant masterpiece, but why it was also a disaster for open wheel racing. And I'm going to show you guys that, yes, it does seem like a loophole, and I'll tell you why people are so. I won't get too technical into the engine. I won't tell you how it was kind of birthed. A lot of people kind of know it. If you guys want to read the book Beast by Jake Gurse, I read it. It's an amazing book. It kind of gives you the insight of why this engine came to be and what the necessity was. And just Roger Penske just trying to go for a challenge, But yeah, I'm just gonna tackle this. I'm gonna tackle this from a different angle rather than defending Penske all day long, because I want to give you guys a critical reason of how to set off a chain reaction, and why people will sit there and stumble and say, oh, because by the end of the video, I'm probably going to tell you, I'm going to tell you guys why it wasn't a loophole and why I didn't break any rules. But I'm also going to tell you, guys why it shouldn't have been exploited, or why it shouldn't have been exploited, or the advantage shouldn't have gone to Penske, or and stuff like that. I'll give you guys an angle. This is a controversial engine. I think it should have existed. Yeah, it was kind of a cool marvel, but did it kill open wheel racing? Was it a right call for the time? No one will know. But I'll give you guys the reasons why it's not considered a loophole breaker and why it is in some ways, and why a lot of people condemn it. So I'm going to give you guys both sides of the story, or my thoughts of, and I'm going to use what I learned from the book from Beast and what I've read on the internet and stuff like that, and yeah, to kind of educate you a little bit on, it's why it seems like a rule book, but it's not. But it does feel like it's an exploit of the rule book that was aimed at the small guy. Just keep that in mind. These engine rules were made for the small guy, not a multi-million-dollar race team that's won the Indy 500 multiple times. So, and you're going to see why a lot of people, why USAC did their best, why Cart and the Indianapolis 500 and Tony George, who plays a huge role in why this engine was the way it was. So, but yeah, I'll get to that in a minute. It's quite an interesting story. I think it's quite the mind bender. But I'll give you guys more of why it's considered a loophole by many, but why it shouldn't be, and why it killed the Indy 500 and all this other stuff. Why it probably killed open wheel racing for many years. So, and reason why we have spec cars now. So, and stuff like that. So I guess I'll tell you guys kind of Roger Penske's innovative ways and his actually, this might be a four-parter. I'm going to talk to you guys about Roger Penske and kind of his ways of exploiting and finding the gray area in the rule book, finding the unfair advantage. And yes, I'm going to use the unfair advantage wording a lot. So, and why some of his moves are great, why some of his moves are not. So, and kind of to just kind of tell you guys why people feel the way they do about this motor and how it changed open wheel racing. So yeah, I'll see you guys later. Peace out. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. You guys were informed a little bit better, because I want to because it's just kind of get the word out there and kind of inform people better, and instead of just saying, oh, it just abused the loophole, and it just abused the loophole, instead of just doing your research, all right, I'll see you guys later. Peace.